Ailensa had heard many things in her parents' home that cut deep, but nothing sliced as cleanly as the sentence Tyann had delivered that afternoon in the hallway. They were standing beneath the framed family portraits, every one of them centered around her older sister, when Tyann had glanced at her phone, looked up and said casually, "My credit was bad, so I borrowed yours." She said it the way someone might comment on the weather. No guilt, no hesitation, no awareness of the damage packed into those 6 words. Ailensa stared at her for several seconds, making sure she had heard correctly. "You used my information?" she asked quietly. Tyann shrugged, flipping her hair back. "Relax. It's family. It's not that serious." Before Ailensa could respond, Coman stepped into the hallway, his tone already prepared to dismiss her concern. "It's not a crime if you're family," he muttered, waving one hand as if brushing away dust. "Don't make a fuss. Your sister needed help." Sanala didn't speak at all. She stood behind them, arms folded, expression tight with the kind of selective silence she had perfected over the years. Ailensa didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't try to defend the boundary they had ignored. She simply stepped past them, walked down the stairs, and let the front door close behind her with a soft click. The weight on her back wasn't anger. It was recognition. This wasn't the first time her family had treated her stability as a resource for Tyan's convenience. It was simply the first time the consequences were this severe. That night, seated at her small kitchen table in Alexandria, Ailensa opened her laptop, pulled up the documentation, and uploaded every piece of proof she had. By morning, her sister's condo wasn't quiet anymore. Before she dove into the chaos that would follow, Ailensa recorded an introduction for the audience who would one day hear her story. "My name is Ailensa," she said softly into the microphone. "If you asked anyone in my family to describe me, they'd probably say I'm the steady one, the dependable daughter, the calm sister, the one who doesn't make trouble, the one who keeps quiet so the house stays peaceful." Pause. But still water can hide a current strong enough to pull a ship under. And Tyanha, her older sister, had never understood that. Growing up, Tyanha had learned to fill every room she entered. She was 3 years older, louder, glossier. Her confidence inflated by endless applause from Coman and Sanala. They excused her tantrums as passion, her irresponsibility as ambition, her cruelty as honesty. Ailensa, on the other hand, became the contrast that made her shine. "Our family home in Arlington always looks warm from the outside," Ailensa narrated. "Brick exterior, trimmed hedges, porch light glowing. But inside, the air has its own hierarchy." There was an unspoken script. Tyanha performed. Her parents applauded. And Ailensa smiled politely from the sidelines, quiet enough to be convenient, present enough to fill the missing spaces. She never wanted to compete with her sister for attention. But she never expected to become the safety net for Tyanha's recklessness either. 2 weeks before everything fell apart, they'd had brunch at the house. The cinnamon rolls smelled warm, sunlight pooled on the table, and the good dishes were arranged like props for an advertisement. But beneath the brightness, something had already begun to shift, something only Ailensa could sense. Looking back, she realized her instincts had been whispering a warning she had ignored for far too long. At that brunch, Tyanha arrived fashionably late, wrapped in a designer coat she wore like armor. She swept into the dining room with the kind of dramatic flair she believed was her trademark. "Sorry everyone," she said, waving her hand. "I had a meeting run late." Coman and Sanala practically leaned across the table to greet her, their smiles bright and eager. "Tell us about your investment group," Sanala urged. "You must be doing so well." Tyanha launched into stories. Lavish dinners, luxury travel, connections she insisted were exclusive. But as Ailensa listened, she noticed the inconsistencies. The numbers didn't track. Timelines didn't align. The spending didn't match the income. "Still doing that little finance job?" Tyanha asked, turning her attention to Ailensa for the first time that morning. Ailensa smiled in that quiet way she used when people underestimated her. Yes, she replied. Still analyzing data. She didn't mention the sensitive cases she handled. She didn't mention the patterns she identified for a living, the anomalies she hunted, the financial truths she could spot a mile away. Her job didn't require bragging. It required precision. And that precision told her something was off. She pushed the thought aside during brunch, tucking it into the corner of her mind the way she'd learned to tuck away so many things. Family has a way of muting instincts, of convincing you to ignore the obvious because love or duty asks you to. After brunch, as she drove back to Alexandria, she couldn't shake the unease. She brewed tea, sat by her window, and stared out at the late afternoon sky. The feeling lingered, faint but insistent. And when the credit alert hit her phone days later, the unease sharpened into clarity. The alert came on a Wednesday afternoon, just as Ailensa was reviewing a series of suspicious payments at work. The timing felt poetic in a cruel way. Her phone buzzed with a notification. New credit inquiry. Her mind didn't jump to fear. It slid into stillness. Stillness meant the pieces were finally lining up. She stepped away from her desk into one of the private review rooms, closed the door, and pulled up her full credit report. There it was. A newly opened personal loan. $90,000, sitting under her name like an anchor someone else had tied to her. Her hands didn't shake. She had seen fraud before. Just never with her own name attached. She called her sister. "Hey, what's up, Ailensa?" Tianha answered, her tone sugary and polished. "I got a credit alert," Ailensa said calmly. "Did you use my information for something?" Beat of silence. Then a casual laugh. "My credit's bad, so I borrowed yours." Borrowed. As if it were a sweater. "Tianha," Ailensa said quietly. "That's identity theft." "Oh my God," Tianha groaned. "Don't be dramatic." Before Ailensa could respond, she heard footsteps and her father's voice. "What's going on?" "She's freaking out over a loan," Tianha said breezily. "I used her name. Her score is better." "It's not a crime if it's family," Komen said, like it was an ancient rule carved in stone. Ailensa had to pull the phone away. Not because it hurt, because it confirmed everything she had feared since childhood. Her comfort was disposable. Her security was negotiable. Her boundaries were optional. "Dad," she said quietly, "she put my career at risk." He sighed, irritated. "Help her out. She always lands on her feet." But this time she would land on someone else's. Ailensa ended the call. She stared at the loan documents again. The signature wasn't hers. The income was inflated. Whoever forged it assumed she wouldn't fight. They were wrong. The next morning Ailensa did what she did best. She followed the truth. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. Methodically. She documented everything. Screenshots, timestamps, payment histories, discrepancies. The forged signature, loopy and careless, so unlike her precise hand. The inflated income. The credit inquiry trail. She saved everything in a secure folder the way she would for any investigation. While she worked, her phone buzzed repeatedly. First from Sonola. "Your sister is upset. Don't make this bigger than it is." Then from Komen. "Handle it quietly. Family doesn't need drama." And finally from Tianha. "You're making this ugly. Just let it go. I'll pay it back eventually." Ailensa muted the messages. She wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt. Not anymore. She was focused. She opened the internal system she used at work, not to investigate someone else, but to report her own case through the proper legal channel. She uploaded the folder. The progress bar moved slowly, carrying the weight of everything she had swallowed for years. When the green checkmark finally appeared, she closed her laptop gently. Not with triumph, with relief. They expected her to stay quiet. They expected her to absorb the damage the way she always had. But quiet did not mean powerless. And stillness did not mean weak. She had spent her whole life learning how to see through polished lies, how to follow patterns, how to piece together what others tried to hide. This time, the truth she uncovered belonged to her. And the consequences would finally belong to the one who created them. By sunrise, a field team was on its way to Tianha's condo. Ailensa didn't need to watch. Justice doesn't need an audience. The next morning, the sunrise over Arlington looked soft, almost gentle. Gold light brushing the rooftops, birds cutting through the quiet sky. But beneath that stillness, a storm was already moving. At 7:14 a.m., Ailensa received the first notification on her phone. Action initiated. Field team deployed. The words appeared in simple black text, official and calm, but they carried a weight that settled deep in her chest. She didn't pace. She didn't wring her hands. Instead, she poured herself a cup of tea and stood by the window, letting the warmth steady her. At 7:19 a.m., the second notification arrived. Entry executed. Ailensa closed her eyes and inhaled slowly. Not relief. Not triumph. Something sturdier, like truth finally having a place to land. She didn't need to imagine how it unfolded, but she did. Tianha opening the door in a silk robe, irritation flashing across her face. Her expression shifting when the badges came into view. Entitlement peeling back in layers. Drawers opening. Documents lifted. Devices secured. Conversations no longer under her control. Justice doesn't shout. It arrives with purpose. By noon, Ailensa knew the news had reached her parents. She could almost feel the vibration of their outrage pressing through the air toward her apartment. Her phone stayed silent on the counter. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she showered, dressed in dark slacks and a simple blouse, and prepared herself for what she knew would come. She wasn't summoned, but she drove to her parents' house anyway. Not out of guilt, not out of fear, but because she wanted to stand inside her truth with unshaken legs. Today wouldn't be about defending herself. Today would be about naming what had been done, and refusing to carry it any further. The ward living room had always been arranged for admiration rather than comfort. Lemon-polished floors, curated decor, framed milestones, each one featuring Tianha at the center. But today the air held no warmth, only tension. Komen stood near the mantel, arms crossed, jaw clenched tight enough to crack bone. Sanala perched on the edge of the couch, wringing a tissue until it shredded. Neither greeted Ailensa. Neither offered her a seat. "What did you do?" Komen demanded. His voice low but trembling with a panic he tried to disguise as authority. Ailensa removed her coat and draped it neatly over a chair. "I protected myself," she replied evenly. "You destroyed your sister's life," Sanala said, her voice cracking like thin glass. "Agents at her home. Neighbors watching. You humiliated her." Ailensa met her mother's eyes. "She stole my identity." "She was struggling," Sanala insisted. "Families help each other. Stealing my credit and forging my signature is not help," Ailensa said softly. "And your response wasn't concern. It was dismissal." Komen stepped forward. "You should have come to us. We would have handled it quietly." Ailensa let out a soft, incredulous breath. "Handled it? Like when you told me not to be dramatic? Or when you said it wasn't a crime because we're family?" The words landed like heavy stones. Komen's face tensed. His mouth opened to argue, then closed again, the truth too sharp to hold. "She didn't mean any harm," he muttered weakly. "But she caused harm," Ailensa replied. "And intent doesn't erase impact." Sanala's eyes welled. "Tianha is terrified, Ailensa." "She should be," Ailensa answered not unkindly. "Accountability isn't cruelty. It's correction." The room went silent. Not the familiar, suffocating silence of her childhood. A heavier, stranger silence, one filled with the truth they had run from for years. And Ailensa stood centered inside it, steady and unafraid. "Where is she now?" Ailensa asked, her voice calm but unwavering. Komen hesitated before answering. "Being interviewed." Bitterness coated every syllable, as if the consequences offended him more than the crime. Ailensa nodded once. Good. Sinala's voice broke. How can you say that? Ailensa drew a breath, letting years of unspoken truth surface. Because she didn't steal out of desperation. She didn't steal to survive. She stole because she believed she could, because you taught her she would never face consequences. Her words were measured, not loud, but each one struck with precision. Every time she lied, you excused her. Every time she hurt someone, you defended her. Every time she failed, you made someone else carry the weight. This time that someone was me. Coleman looked down, the first crack in his certainty showing. Sinala clutched her tissue, shaking her head. She's your sister, she whispered. And I love her, Ailensa replied. But love without boundaries becomes permission. She stepped closer to them, not aggressively, simply grounded. You asked me to stay quiet. But silence would have destroyed my career. Silence would have cost me everything I built. Silence would have told you, and her, that my well-being is always optional. Neither parent spoke. For the first time in her life, Ailensa watched the script slip from their hands. She glanced toward the hallway lined with photos. There was Tianha at prom. Tianha at graduation. Tianha receiving awards. And Ailensa, always present only as a background figure, never centered, never celebrated. I'm done being the shadow that keeps her comfortable, she said. If she is old enough to forge signatures, she is old enough to face the consequences. A breath trembled out of Sinala. So that's it, she whispered. You're choosing yourself. Ailensa held her mother's gaze gently. Finally, she said. Yes. And the truth settled over the three of them like a long-delayed storm finally breaking. When Ailensa left her parents' house, the winter air hit her skin with a clarity that felt almost cleansing. The sky was cloudless, a sharp blue that made the streets look polished. She walked down the driveway with steady steps, feeling lighter with each one. She wasn't leaving in anger. She wasn't fleeing. She was simply done carrying what wasn't hers. Her phone buzzed 3 times before she reached her car. She didn't look at it until she settled into the driver's seat. The notifications weren't from her parents. They were from the investigative team. Interview completed. Evidence consistent. Ailensa exhaled. The process was moving exactly as it should. Clean, factual, free of emotion. A second message arrived minutes later. Asset review in progress. Items connected to the fraudulent loan secured. She didn't need details. She spent years evaluating cases just like this. She knew the cadence, the precision, the neutrality of the system. Fraud wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was procedural. And so was justice. She drove toward the federal building for her scheduled meeting, her fingers loose on the steering wheel. For once, she felt no urge to rehearse explanations or justify her decisions. The truth was already documented. This wasn't a battle of narratives. It was a matter of evidence. As she parked, her phone buzzed again. This time a message from an unknown number. We appreciate your cooperation. Documentation reviewed. Clear violations confirmed. A quiet calm moved through her chest. No joy. Not vindication. Something more grounded. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one absorbing the damage. She was the one naming it. The one protecting her own future. She stepped out of the car, straightened her coat, and walked toward the entrance. The next chapter wouldn't be written by her parents, or Tianha, or the family narrative that had boxed her in since childhood. It would be written by her. The days that followed unfolded differently than Ailensa expected. Not explosive, not chaotic, just quiet. A clean quiet, the kind that arrives after a storm has already done its work. Midweek, she received the official statement. The fraudulent loan had been fully traced, the documentation airtight, and the responsibility placed precisely where it belonged. Nothing public. Nothing humiliating. Just the consequences aligning with the actions. Ailensa wasn't surprised when her parents avoided calling. Shame has its own silence, one heavier than anything she ever carried. She let the distance sit. Not to punish them, just to breathe without their expectations pulling at her. Days later, a courier slid an envelope under her door. Inside were revised trust papers from the family attorney. Responsibilities restructured. Financial controls reassigned. Protections added in her name. For the first time, her parents acknowledged in writing what they couldn't say aloud. They had enabled Tianha, and there were consequences. At work, her supervisor stopped by her desk, tapping a folder lightly against his palm. "We're forming a new investigative group," he said. "Focused on emerging financial abuse patterns. We want you on it." Ailensa didn't answer immediately. She let the offer sit in her mind, solid, empowering. For once, her future wasn't something she had to protect from others. It was something she could build. Later that night, she sat on her balcony with a cup of warm tea. The city lights flickered like small, steady beacons. She whispered into the cool air, "I'm not the quiet one anymore. I'm the one who stepped out." The wind carried her words, soft but certain. She didn't feel guilt, or fear, or doubt. It felt new. The next chapter was hers alone, and she was finally ready to write it. The following morning, Ailensa woke before her alarm, wrapped in a rare kind of stillness. Not the numb silence she grew up with, but a quiet she had chosen. She sat up slowly, letting the early light spill across her bedroom floor. For years, the first thing she felt when waking was the weight of unspoken expectations. Calls she needed to return, crises she needed to absorb, apologies she didn't owe. Today there was none of that. Just breath. Just space. She brewed a cup of chai and settled at her kitchen table with her laptop open, not for work but to ground herself in routine. Her inbox contained updates from the investigative team. Clean, direct, respectful. Exactly the kind of communication her family had never learned to offer. As she read through the messages, a faint knock sounded at her door. She paused, hesitating. When she opened it, she found an envelope on the floor. No courier this time, just a simple handwritten note tucked under the edge. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Tohali, her mother's brother, the only relative who'd ever treated her with quiet fairness. Inside was a short message. "I heard what happened. Protecting yourself is not betrayal. Silence can be survival, but it can also be surrender. You chose strength." Ailensa sat on the couch, reading the words again and again. Someone outside the immediate chaos had seen her. Really seen her. She pressed the note to her chest for a moment, letting the validation settle deep into a place inside her that had been empty since childhood. Then she opened her journal and wrote, "Today, I begin trusting my own judgment more than their fear." For the first time she believed it. At work later that day, the atmosphere hummed with its usual rhythm. Phones ringing, keyboards tapping, quiet conversations rising and falling in the background. But for Ailensa, everything felt subtly different. When her supervisor, Marin, passed her desk, she paused. "You seem lighter," Marin observed. Did something shift? Ailensa hesitated, then nodded. Yes, something finally shifted. Marin smiled in that intuitive way leaders sometimes do. "Good. You carry a lot for someone so quiet. I'm glad the weight is changing." For a moment, the words nearly undid her. She swallowed them gently and continued her work. Around lunchtime she met her colleague, Tavi, in the break room. He leaned against the counter, studying her. "You okay? You've had a focused intensity this week." "Focused," she repeated softly. "That's a good word. Is it family stuff?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Yes. But I handled it the way it needed to be handled." Tavi nodded with the kind of respect that didn't pry. "Then good for you." They ate in companionable silence, and for once, she didn't feel the need to shrink or pretend everything was fine. When she returned to her desk, she found a message from the investigations division confirming the next steps of the case. Efficient, respectful, final. She felt herself exhale. Not from relief that her sister was facing consequences, but from relief that she no longer carried the burden of protecting everyone else at her own expense. As the day ended, Marin stopped by again. "Think about that new unit we discussed," she said. "You'd be perfect for it." Ailensa nodded slowly. For the first time she felt she could say yes to something because she wanted it, not because it kept the peace. That evening, as Ailensa walked into her apartment, a soft winter drizzle tapped against her windows. She set her keys down, slipped off her shoes, and let the quiet envelope her. But it wasn't long before her phone buzzed again, not with accusations this time, but with a name she didn't expect to see, Tianha. Voice message. Long one. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. Then she pressed play. Tianha's voice was shaky, brittle, fractured in places where arrogance usually held firm. "I don't understand why you did this," she said. "I mean, I do, but I don't. You've never pushed back. You've always just helped." Ailensa closed her eyes, listening. "The agents came in like I was some criminal," Tianha continued, voice cracking. "They went through my drawers, my laptop, everything. And Mom's crying and Dad's furious and I." A shaky inhale. "I didn't think it would get this far." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I just assumed you'd absorb it. Like always." There it was, the truth beneath every betrayal. The assumption that Ailensa's boundaries were suggestions. That her life was collateral. That her silence was their safety net. "Please call me," Tianha finished. "Please." Ailensa replayed the message once more, not to study it, but to feel what she didn't feel. Guilt. She typed a single response. "I hope you learn from this. But I am not the person who fixes the consequences of your actions anymore." She hit send, blocked the number, and placed her phone face down. The rain outside softened. So did something inside her. Not forgiveness. Not anger. Just release. 2 days later, Ailensa received another envelope, this time with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note in Sonala's delicate, looping script. "Your sister is devastated. Your father is embarrassed. This family is falling apart because of your choices. Please come home so we can restore order." Ailensa sat down slowly, letting the words settle into the air around her. "My choices," she whispered. "Or yours?" She leaned back in her chair, letting herself feel everything the message stirred. Old pain, old patterns, old expectations that once defined her entire identity. But none of them could claim her anymore. She picked up a pen and wrote a measured reply. "I am not responsible for the consequences of choices I did not make. I love you, but I will no longer sacrifice myself to maintain illusions that harm me." She sealed the letter and mailed it. Whether her mother understood or not was no longer her burden to shoulder. That evening, she took herself out for dinner, something she rarely did alone. She sat at a quiet corner table, ordered a warm bowl of soup, and watched as families chatted around her. No tension. No hierarchy. No performance. Just people sharing space honestly. She realized then how foreign that had always been in her own home. When she returned to her apartment, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Love without accountability becomes manipulation." She closed the journal gently, a sense of peace settling over her like a soft blanket. For the first time, she wasn't mourning what her family wasn't. She was accepting what she deserved. By the end of the week, Ailensa woke with a new clarity, subtle but unmistakable. Her houseplants seemed greener. Her apartment felt warmer. Even the morning light looked different. After making breakfast, she stepped out onto her balcony with a cup of coffee and inhaled deeply. The city buzzed softly below her, alive but not overwhelming. She thought about everything she had endured, the dismissal, the gaslighting, the pressure to remain small. For years, she believed choosing herself meant betraying her family. Now she understood that betraying herself was the greater crime. At noon, she met her colleague Tavi at a quiet cafe. He watched her closely as they settled in. "You look grounded," he said. "More than I've ever seen you." "I am," she said simply. "I finally stopped apologizing for wanting peace." Tavi nodded. "That's a hard thing to do. Especially with family." "Especially with family," she echoed. After lunch, she walked through downtown, letting the cold air brush against her face. She passed a bookstore and stepped inside on impulse. In the back corner sat a shelf of blank journals. She picked one with a deep red cover, strong, bold, not quiet. At home, she opened it and wrote the first sentence on the first page. Stillness is not weakness. It is power when chosen. She sat back, letting the meaning settle. She wasn't the quiet daughter anymore. She wasn't the background character in her own life. She was someone who drew a line and refused to let others cross it again. And as she looked out the window at the city pulsing with possibility, she realized something profound. The story ahead of her belonged fully to her, and she was ready for it. The next morning, Ailensa woke to a softer kind of quiet, the kind that didn't ask anything of her. She stretched slowly, letting her body uncurl from years of being braced for the next emotional blow. When she stepped into her kitchen, the sun was just beginning to brighten the sky. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the early traffic drift by. For a long time, she had believed her life depended on her family's approval, as if their validation was the only compass she had. But now, standing in her own space, her own choices echoing back to her, she realized she didn't need them to define her direction. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. Your sister is home. Things are complicated. Call if you want details. Oh, Holly. She appreciated his gentleness. But she didn't open the message further. Instead, she got dressed and made her way to work. As she entered the building, several colleagues nodded to her, some offering warm smiles. There was no tension here. No hierarchy. No invisible test she had to pass. Marin met her near the elevators. Have you given the new unit any thought? She asked. Ailensa nodded. I think I'm ready for something bigger. Marin offered a small, proud smile. Good. I'll set up the paperwork. As she walked toward her office, Ailensa realized that this sense of possibility, of forward motion, was something she'd never felt within her own family. And she wasn't willing to give it up. Not now. Not ever. Later that afternoon, during a brief break, Ailensa stepped outside to feel the wind on her face. The crisp air brushed her cheeks, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She leaned on the railing overlooking the courtyard as Tavi approached her, hands tucked into his coat pockets. You seem taller lately, he said with a faint smile. Not physically, but here. He gestured above his head. She laughed softly. I think I finally stopped shrinking. Good, he replied. People forget shrinking is a choice. Expanding is one too. She looked at him thoughtfully, letting the words sink in. It feels strange, she admitted. Choosing myself without guilt. Strange doesn't mean wrong, he said. It just means new. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before he added, If you ever want to talk or not talk, I'm around. Thank you, Tavi, she said sincerely. When she returned to her desk, she opened an email from the investigative team. Case finalized. Protective measures in place. You are clear of all liability. A wave of relief washed over her. Not sharp but warm, steady, like stepping into sunlight. She closed the email and took a deep breath. The past weeks had been heavy, but now the weight was shifting. She wasn't just surviving. She was transforming. And she could feel the difference in her bones. That evening, when Ailensa arrived home, the hallway outside her apartment felt unusually still, as though holding its breath. She unlocked her door and stepped into the familiar warmth of her living room. She set down her things, brewed tea, and curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs. The day had been full, but the good kind of full. She thought about Sanala's letter, about the heavy lines of guilt woven into every sentence. Her mother meant well in her own flawed way, but meaning well didn't undo harm. The doorbell rang. Unexpected, sharp in the quiet. She stood slowly, cautious but calm, and looked through the peephole. It was Tohali. She opened the door. Can I come in? He asked gently. She nodded and stepped aside. He sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded. I won't stay long. I thought you should know how things are. Ailensa braced herself without tensing. She had learned the difference. Tianha is shaken, he said. Not angry. Not blaming you anymore. Just confronted by the truth. Ailensa exhaled. Good. Your parents are struggling, he continued. But they're also seeing things they refused to see before. She nodded. She didn't feel triumph. Just certainty. You did the right thing, Tohali said softly. I'm proud of you. Ailensa's throat tightened unexpectedly. Thank you, she whispered. After he left, she sat on the couch again, letting the silence settle. Not heavy. Not punishing. Just present. The kind of silence she could build a life in. The next morning, as sunlight crept across her bedroom floor, Ailensa felt something she hadn't felt in months, rest. Genuine rest. Not the exhausted collapse of someone overburdened, but the kind that comes from alignment. She moved through her morning slowly, intentionally. Coffee. Soft music. A warm shower. She chose a deep green blouse for work, a color she rarely wore. It looked like confidence when she saw herself in the mirror. On her way out, she passed the row of plants she kept near the balcony door. Their leaves were glossy, vibrant, thriving. She smiled faintly. Maybe growth was contagious. At work, Marin finalized the paperwork for her new role. This unit won't be easy, Marin warned kindly. But you're built for hard things. And you see patterns most people overlook. I'm ready, Ailensa said. And she meant it. That afternoon, while reviewing case materials for her new position, her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Ailensa. The voice was soft, fragile. Ainha. I'm not calling to fight, her sister said quickly. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not because things got hard for me, but because I never saw how much I relied on you to clean my messes. Ailensa closed her eyes. The apology wasn't perfect, but it was real. Thank you for saying that, she replied gently. But rebuilding trust takes more than words. I know, Tianha whispered. I just hope one day we can talk again. Maybe, Ailensa said. And she meant that too. After they hung up, she felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness, but space where forgiveness could someday live. That evening, Ailensa drove to a quiet overlook just outside the city, the place she used to visit in college whenever the world felt too heavy. The view was the same. The river stretching wide, the distant bridge glowing softly under the fading sunlight, a handful of boats drifting lazily across the surface. She sat on the hood of her car, pulling her coat tighter as the wind nipped at her cheeks. She breathed in deeply. Fresh air. Fresh possibility. She pulled out her notebook, the same red-covered journal she'd started the week before, and wrote slowly, deliberately. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of boundaries. She closed the notebook and stared at the horizon. 4 years, she had been waiting for her family to change. Waiting for someone to see her. Waiting for someone to choose her. But the real change began when she chose herself. Her phone buzzed again. A message from her supervisor confirming her start date with the new investigative unit. Ailensa smiled. It felt symbolic, stepping into a role that demanded strength, precision, and clarity. All things she had possessed quietly for years. Now finally she could use them without apology. She stayed until the last sliver of sunlight disappeared, letting the darkness arrive gently, without fear. When she finally drove home, the road ahead felt clear. Not predictable. Not easy. But hers. The next day unfolded with a new rhythm. Not faster, not louder, simply steadier. When Ailensa walked into her apartment after work, she felt grounded. She placed her bag on the counter, lit a candle scented with sage and cedar, and prepared a simple dinner. No frantic calls. No guilt pressing at her sternum. No expectation to manage someone else's crisis. After eating, she sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by quiet. She opened her notebook again and wrote, "Choosing myself was not rebellion. It was repair." A knock interrupted her. Hesitant, she stood unsure who to expect. When she opened the door, Sonala stood there, her mother, shoulders small, eyes uncertain. "May I come in?" her mother asked. Ailensa hesitated, then stepped aside. Sonala walked slowly, taking in the apartment with a kind of quiet awe. "It's peaceful here," she said softly. "It feels like you." Ailensa didn't respond. Her mother sat on the edge of the couch, twisting her hands. "I didn't come to convince you to fix anything," she said. "I came to listen." That alone stunned Ailensa. Sonala took a breath. "I raised you to think being quiet made life easier. But I see now that I taught you to disappear." Ailensa felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry," her mother whispered, eyes glistening. "Not for the consequences your sister faces. But for all the times I let her overshadow you. All the times I let you be the strong one because it was convenient for us." Ailensa exhaled slowly. "I needed you to see that." "I see it now," her mother said. "I just hope it isn't too late." "It's not too late," Ailensa replied gently. "But it's different now." And for the first time, her mother nodded with understanding instead of denial. After her mother left, closing the door quietly behind her, Ailensa sank onto the couch. Not from exhaustion, but from the emotional weight of something shifting, something long overdue. She stared at the ceiling, letting everything settle inside her. The apology wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real was enough for now. Over the next few days, life returned to its new normal. At work, she learned the rhythms of her new unit. High-level investigations, nuanced financial patterns, cases that required both sharp analysis and emotional distance. Marin checked in regularly, offering guidance without pressure. Tavi stopped by her desk often, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with quiet encouragement. "You're doing well," he said one afternoon. "Better than you think." She believed him. One evening after work, she decided to walk home instead of driving. The air was cold but refreshing. She passed street musicians, small cafes glowing with warm light, people laughing freely on sidewalks. A world that existed without the weight of expectation. Halfway home, her phone buzzed. Text: "Thank you for hearing me. And for drawing the line you needed. Vanilla." Ailensa replied simply, "Thank you for trying." When she finally reached her apartment, she stood at the window, watching the city breathe beneath her. Everything felt different now, not perfect but honest. And honesty was a beginning. The following weekend, Ailensa drove out to the old lake where her grandfather used to take her as a child. The trees surrounding the water were bare, branches etched against the winter sky. The lake was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the gray clouds above. She walked along the shore, her boots crunching softly in the gravel. Memories washed over her, her grandfather's calm voice, the way he used to say, "Still water shows the clearest truth." She sat on a weathered bench near the water's edge and allowed herself to breathe deeply. Here she didn't feel small. Here she felt whole. She pulled out her journal and wrote, "I am not the version of myself they built. I am the version I chose." A soft breeze rippled across the lake, breaking the reflection into shimmering fragments. She watched it reform, slow and steady. She smiled. As she stood to leave, her phone buzzed again, this time from her new team. A major case would begin on Monday. High stakes, complex. Exactly the kind of work she had always been capable of but never allowed herself to claim. She felt a spark of excitement, small but sure. She wasn't running anymore. She was rising. Back in her apartment that evening, Ailensa prepared for the week ahead. She organized her workspace, laid out documents, and set up a fresh folder for her first major case. She felt the quiet vibrancy of someone stepping into alignment with her own potential. Later she cooked herself a meal, something simple but warm, and ate it slowly at the dining table. Not distracted. Not rushing. Just present. After dinner, she lit a candle and curled up with her journal again. She wrote about boundaries, about survival, about how it felt to protect herself without apology. Then she wrote something she hadn't expected. "I am learning to love myself in the spaces where they never looked." Tears pricked her eyes. Not from sadness but from truth. She closed the journal and stepped onto the balcony. The city lights blinked beneath her like quiet constellations. She wrapped her arms around herself and whispered into the night, "I'm proud of you." For once she meant it. On Monday morning, as the sun rose soft and pale, Ailensa walked into her office with a sense of purpose she'd never felt so fully before. The halls buzzed with activity, but she moved through them with calm confidence. When she reached her new team's conference room, Marin smiled warmly. "Ready?" Ailensa nodded. "More than ready." They reviewed the case files together, her insights unfolding naturally, her voice steady and sure. When the meeting ended, Tavi tapped her shoulder. "Hey," he said softly. "You're different now." "Better?" she asked lightly. "Stronger," he corrected. She carried that word with her for the rest of the day. That evening back home, she brewed tea and stood by her window again. The horizon glowed with shades of gold and rose, a quiet promise stretching into the distance. Her phone buzzed once, a final message from her sister. "I'm working on myself. Thank you for waking me up." Ailensa smiled gently. Growth was possible. For all of them. But this time it wasn't her job to guide it. She stepped onto the balcony, letting the wind brush through her hair. This was the life she crafted through courage, not compliance. Through truth, not silence. Through choosing herself instead of shrinking. As the city lights shimmered beneath her, she whispered a quiet vow. "I will never disappear again." And in that moment, Ailensa finally understood. Freedom wasn't loud. Didn't explode. It arrived softly, steadily. Exactly when she decided to stop surviving and start living.